Kashmir, Toman,
He
nice
doesn't
to,
speak.
nice to meet you.
I'm South African.
Okay, South
Originally,
African.
originally.
What is it? Goed dag?
Sorry?
Goed dag? Or isn't it, Afrikaans, isn't it like Dutch?
Afrikaans, yeah, but my parents came from Eastern Europe too.
Yeah, yeah.
They came from Poland now, Belarus.
Belarus, yeah, 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 yeah.
So he doesn't know any Czech or Slovak.
Say dobre.
Tak velmi sympatický konsul, velmi nám the
Jo.
consul is very
Jo, otevřený,
sympathical
jo.
and is very hopeful, and so that's great that we have this nice
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah.
And the Slovak consul is also very
Uh-huh.
good, but they are much more limited in terms of.
Where are they? Where is the
Right
Slav?
now they have a new building. I don't know about you know the name Jan Wilczek. Jan Wilczek is a molecular biologist who actually has patented all these drugs, Humira and all those that are on TV against inflammatory bowel disease and everything, and he's super
So
well.
he must be a millionaire. Yeah.
Now, but he came, you know, and he had a mansion and a foundation, and the Slovak consulate recently purchased that mansion from him. And they had an event. I was in California just last week, so I missed that event, but I went to the christening of the building, which was kind of interesting because they had a Catholic priest, a Protestant priest, and a rabbi.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
Building. But in terms of the programming, they still need a permission from above, and if it concerns anything touchy, you know, they are careful. And it's very difficult to talk about.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out to the Bohemian National Hall for this event. I've been looking forward to this for a while. This is a kind of encore event. Hopefully there are people in the audience who were here 3 years ago now already when we had sort of the prequel event to this one, when Professor Toman came and gave a talk on the situation for Jews in the Czech lands, kind of at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. And I'm here, by the way, in my aspect as president of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences New York chapter. And this talk is part of a series which has been an ongoing collaboration between our organization and our sister organization, the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews. And it's been very fruitful. We put together this series of talks that were mostly around literary themes on the role of Jews from the Czech lands and Slovakia in literature. And when we were putting this series together, we had the idea of starting it off with a kind of historical talk to introduce the setting of Jews in the Czech lands and Slovakia. And we recruited Professor Toman to do this, and it was a great talk, of course, just on the eve of the pandemic. And we had a lot of positive feedback at that point, and had the idea to bring Professor Toman back to kind of continue the narrative that was begun there to help us understand better the situation for Jews in the Czech lands into the 19th century. So, one major health crisis later, we're able to bring this event to you. Before I just say a couple more words to introduce Professor Toman, I would like to invite Eva to say a couple things about further programming that the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews is going to be offering in the coming weeks.
Thank you. So I'm Eva Derman, and you may get emails from me. I am president of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews. And I just would like to inform you about our upcoming events. We will be holding a memorial service for the Czechoslovak Jewish victims of Holocaust. It will be here on Sunday, March 12th at 2 p.m. If you haven't registered and would like to attend, we would welcome you. Would you be so kind and leave your email address so we can send you an invitation? Then April 4th, we will be sponsoring a concert by an orchestra named Understaffed, young people, a New York-based orchestra, and that will be April 4th. There is news about it, and they will be performing a piece from Josef Suk, from Ernest Bloch, and a contemporary Israeli composer, Shahav Regev. On May 18, Professor Chet Bryant will present talk based on his book about a Czech, German, Jewish, somehow controversial journalist, Egon Erwin Kish. We will be hearing, I think it will be in April, and Pavla Nikolova is organizing it in the Václav Havel Foundation, readings of plays by East European authors, and we'll hear readings of a new play by Luba Lesna from Bratislava called Bookstore Steiner. In the fall, and I just mention it now because I'm very pleased that we'll get 3 very eminent scholars presenting talks on the topic of blood libel, an absurd myth that spread through Europe from Middle Ages to present time, an awful myth that led to pogroms and to an extent to the Holocaust too. And I thank very much, all the organizations here that are helping us, the Bohemian Benevolent Literary Association, the Czech Consulate, our collaborators, the Slovak Consulate, and now Professor Toman. Or you're going to
Just, I introduced Professor Toman fairly thoroughly 3 years ago, and I think at that time I emphasized his aspect as godfather of Czech studies in North America, because an institution he created over 20 years ago, the Czech Studies Workshop, has been an incubator for more than one generation now of scholars in different disciplines, historians, art historians, social scientists, and literary scholars, all interested in the Czech lands. So he has his intellectual children and grandchildren all around. And just introducing him today, I would just emphasize something I've always admired about his career is that it hasn't stayed in one place. He was trained as a linguist and did a lot of really amazing work in linguistics early on, and just kind of migrated into Slavic studies, into art history, has done wonderful work on the history of the interwar avant-gardes in the Czech lands and in other parts of Europe. And in later parts of his career has really made a mark in Jewish studies. And of course, that's the aspect in which he's presenting to us today. So thanks for joining us again, Jindrich Toman.
Thank you very much. Myself on? Is it all right? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Really, I will begin on a cynical note. I hope 3 years ago I was here and I left and a pandemic broke out. I hope this will not happen tomorrow. But it was a bad time for all of us, I think, and we now, I think, realize more than ever than some of the changes are irreversible and that many people are also not with us anymore. Well, thank you for coming here, and despite I was almost on the point of asking for a rescheduling because the Weather Channel has these dramatic news about snow and so on. So I was watching it and I thought, heavens, this will not end well. But I came here and I was talked out of it in a very friendly way. Thank you, Eva. All right, so yes, so there is a topic and there is an interesting historical situation. So I should say I am a historian in that sense, more of anything, a literary historian on that line, on the Jewish line. Jewish history can be written in many, many ways and has been written in many ways. And for the Bohemian or Czech and Moravian and Slovak area, I think, for instance, until today, we don't have any social history or anything that would be really an overwhelming kind of give us a very clear picture. Or I think there is also a lot of space for a political history. So I may touch on some of these things today, but basically what I would like to do is to, I have a lot of text, so it's very textual, I apologize. I try to find some pictures, but there are some pictures. But basically it's very textual, and I would like to go with you through the mid of the 19th century. So please don't be disappointed, but I could not announce a talk, Bohemia's Jews and their mid-third of the century. Nobody would probably come. So I said, and their 19th century. And by that I mean, of course, mostly public history in the sense of what you find in books, of what you find in newspapers, journals, etc., etc. So notes, there's nothing archival here also, and which is a limitation, of course. So, so why this mid-third of the century? The situation is very simple. The beginning, the end of the 18th and 19th centuries are well studied and, or have been at least, there is a base. For instance, by Kestenberg, Gladstein. And that's the beginning of the century, this kind of spillover or continuation of the Enlightenment, mostly of Haskalah, German, from Germany. And the end of the century is studied well as well. So there are whole libraries on the 1890s, 1900s, and so on. So I have really I should say I have no capacity to even go through these many studies that lead to the Prague German Jewish literature, like Max Brod, Kafka, Werfeld, of course, too. And so that's a classic. So the ends of this very long century are kind of under control, and the middle part is kind of forgotten or not regarded usually as very important. Or as we use when I came to this country, I learned a new verb. It's understudied. So that's academic lingo or university lingo. So let's start. So I have this Well, how do we start? When I was here, I think these are the fragments of the previous presentation, a slow revolution. The whole process of Jewish emancipation, and that means self-emancipation and external emancipation, kind of a conglomerate, is surprisingly long. It's from the end of the 18th century, actually until the liberal Austrian Constitution of 1867, which is almost 100 years, if you think about it. That's a period over which laws were changing, attitudes were changing, and so on. So we looked at this, and I think if anyone who was here at that time, we looked at mainly at the so-called degrees of toleration, the Josephinian decrees, which is end of the 18th century, and Joseph's interests were not. He was not a kind of a Philosemite or anything like that. He wanted to build a new state, to organize a new modern state, modernize it through education, modernize the administration, modernize the economy, and even the army, because Prussia was kind of hanging up there in the north, and that was a competition. So, and there was this overarching dictum: be useful to the state, to the new modern state. That was his idea. And he wanted to make Jews useful to the state. He wanted to make others to be useful to the state. So, for instance, he abolished a number of monasteries and religious orders, because he thought that praying the whole day was not useful to the state. So it was his kind of complex philosophy, and everything is kind of offshot of various Enlightenment theologies and philosophies and so on at the same time. So we don't have to stay there. Just two, I put here two short reminders. Preferential treatment according to the Jewish literature is due to the following. Our aim is to make them more useful and of greater service to the state, in particular through better education, instruction, their people through sciences, arts, and crafts. So it's, we can read it in many ways, but I read it as a landmark. Landmarks usually don't come kind of from Monday to Tuesday. They are an expression of longer developments. We don't have to discuss this. This was in many ways a landmark that you can read these decrees or the individual paragraphs, points in the decrees. We can return them and read what is now allowed was not allowed. So you have a kind of a reverse list of what was not allowed before. So the emancipation was definitely sticks out of quite distinctly. And just a reminder, of course, there was an idea of good behavior because we consider imperial the emperor considers it their duty, Jewish duty, as well as a mark of their gratitude, that they should not abuse this, our favor and freedom that has accrued to them, and that they should not cause public offense through dissipation and excesses, and that they should not denigrate the Christian religion, and so on. And whoever commits that will be banished from all our land. So it's a kind of a nice reminder, I am the emperor, and if you don't obey, you will be deported essentially, or driven out of the land. So let's not spend too, if anyone has, by the way, short questions as I'm talking, that's perfectly fine. we don't have to wait for the discussion at the end, but just a reminder. So the 1840s, so this we are taking basically 50 years jump ahead. And why are the 1840s important? Well, the 1840s are important in Central Europe, in Germany, Habsburg monarchy, but all across the continental board, basically. And the idea is that the equilibrium or the consensus among powers that was forged after Napoleon's defeat is now falling apart. And in the 1840s, there is a lot of critics, news, journalists, authors who write really works and commentaries that can only be censored, nothing else, because they are seditious, they are critical of the system. You may have heard the name Metternich, for instance, the Austrian politician who dictated much of the new format of the government. So the 1840s are very important. In Czech, they are called Doba předbřeznová, with several R's in it. So the pre-March time, it's a direct translation, of course, from German, for März. And März here is the month when in Vienna, in Prague, I think also in Berlin, revolutions came about in 1848. So the March days are kind of considered, are the basis of this pre-March period. And depends on how you date it, we can stick to the 1840s, and they end with the revolutions of 1848. And I'll talk about, I don't know how much patience you will have and how much power I will still have in an hour or half an hour. So I will start, I don't know exactly when to end, but I will definitely start with what I call the rapprochement projects and literary projects, which are actually another version of rapprochement projects. And what is the rapprochement project? Before the 1840s, there was not really very much discussion about the position of Jews in Bohemia, Central. There were, of course, legal discussions, and the Josephine decrees are, of course, there, and their kind of derivatives. But by and large, it was not a great social, how should I say, topic. Now, in the 1840s, you will find all of a sudden in magazines, in various publications, you will find, actually, I would say initially, Jewish voices. Jews thinking about what do we do in this period? What do we do now? Now we are kind of heading towards complete emancipation. They were not citizens yet, but what is our position? How can we, as a minority, function in... One great example of functioning was Germany, where Jewish emancipation was well underway, and Jewish German authors were visible authors, and so there is one project by a man from Prague, David Kuh, and his friend Václav Bolemír Nebeský. There should be a Čárka there. And the two of them were sitting in Vienna as students And we're kind of putting all together all sorts of ideas of, on that topic. Literary projects, we'll look at them just in a second. There were two important authors, Siegfried Kappe and Leopold Kompet. But we have also a lot of articles that are in newspapers that are not signed. So there is the discussion has a certain density and cannot be reduced just to two persons, two authors. There is, for instance, and it's quite interesting and gives you a picture of what Austria was at that time, or the monarchy was at that time. Many of them appeared in Germany, in Leipzig. And that was big. Metternich would have liked to censor everything from left to right and right to left. But Saxony in Germany was actually a somewhat more liberal place, and perhaps because of the function of Leipzig, this was a center of publishing, of printing, of book production, and so on. And so it attracted a lot of emigres, and there was actually even a certain emigration from the monarchy to Leipzig. So there is one article in one of these German Jewish publications. It says, "The difficult state of Jews," and it's about Bohemia. The state of Jews is difficult in a country in which the struggle of nationalities and that's important, thus a battle of languages unfolds. Since neutrality is impossible in such a struggle, the Jews must inevitably spoil their position with one of the parties, something they should not do and yet have to. So he has no clear kind of solution. I'll show you next slide. But notice language is very important in all these. And why? Because Bohemian Jews are 99% German speaking. So at that time, they may be bilingual, depends on what you think bilingualism is. But in educational terms, especially in terms of literature and kind of this other type of culture, they are German speaking. Occasionally you see that they spoke Yiddish. That is a really very problematic notion. That is, we are far in the West, we are not in Poland. And they spoke, if they spoke something more colloquial, it was some sort of dialect, essentially, that was a German dialect. At any rate, he continues nicely. What are the Jews supposed to do between Scylla and Charybdis? No narrow-mindedness, no cowardice, no self-interest. Be true sons of your fatherland. Now, what is fatherland? Of course, that's always the big question. So it could be the whole monarchy, but here I think it reads Bohemia, actually. The Jews should help set in motion the very lever of nationality, the language, again, language, and they should join those men who deal with the scholarly study of the Bohemian language, I mean Czech language, to show themselves as Bohemians before other citizens. Unfortunately, one cannot say fellow citizens, because as Jews, we were not fellow citizens. So Jews were not citizens at all. So here's a kind of a mixed cultural program, very kind of flexible, kind of I would say kibitzer program. Well, let's look at what is interesting and keep track of things and be kind of fellow citizens of something like that. It's not a program of assimilation. He doesn't say, let's be Czechs. Okay, that's important. So this is just one of the, I think, 20 articles that I kind of amassed on this, just an example. All right, back to Kuh and Nebesky, these two friends, fellow students from Vienna. It's quite interesting that they hatched it all out while in Vienna, and only later kind of moved back to Prague. And David Kuh, again, in a German and a Saxony-based magazine, I think it was called The Orient, a word to Jews and Slavs. And here, the model of behavior is Germany. In Germany, everything worked. Jews should learn the local vernacular in schools, use it in religious service. It's already Reform Judaism. In Slavic countries, they should cultivate Slavic scholarship and literature. So it is, they would bring about mutually beneficial rapprochement, wohltätige, wechselseitige Annäherung. So it's a model of coexistence, or it's not a model really, but it's a call for coexistence of equals in some sense. And Nebesky, there should be marks here. Some words about relations with Jews and Slavs. And he is perhaps more radical here. The Jew must inevitably lean, note, on some nationality. He doesn't want to and cannot stand alone as a nation. So these were opinions that were kind of floating around, that they discussed, that they did not often know what the consequences are, etc. But he definitely speaks as a Czech and says, who is closer than he, the Jew, with whom he, the Slav, sorry, and he still is in the old system, so he means Czech, essentially, who is closer than he, with whom he found a safe shelter when a night of horror and storm covered Europe and the Jew was chased as a wild animal. So it's a kind of, there is empathy in this, and there is, of course, a question whether he is talking about the same, because he says they cannot be a nation, so they have to lean on someone. So these were kind of discussions that were going on. Nebesky, at any rate, is moving in the direction, and that will be very consequential in later times. The Jews must represent or be on our side. The Jews must represent, must agree or support, I should say, support our cause. And that's the Czech cause. And that's that's Czech nationalism, basically, which moves towards in the direction of national self-determination. Yes?
Okay, so excuse my ignorance.
Yeah.
Okay. May I assume, therefore, that we're speaking about the Jews in Bohemia?
Right.
Right. And according to this article, what it's saying is that the Bohemians consider themselves to be more Slavic than Germanic.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
And therefore, that the Jews
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
even though you said a lot of them spoke German, they should focus on speaking the Slavic language.
the Slavic
Czech.
language. Yeah. They should speak Czech. They should at least learn it. They should follow it or something like that. So what is, the terminology is fluctuating across these documents, but occasionally it's difficult when you see Bohemian, whether it means Bohemian Germans or Bohemian Czechs. But in most cases, we are talking about a conversation between Czechs and Jews in this. So it's something of this level. All right, so the important thing is that the two friends were already slightly differing already at the very beginning. Kuh was interested in the role of Jews maybe across all Slavic countries, including Czech countries. Nebesky was putting into the discussion the question of the Czech cause, which Kuh did not so strongly. Kuh was, for instance, ended with a whole list of segregationist matters like domicile, profession, all sorts of restrictions. Nebesky did not see this. For him, already the Czech cause was very important. Now, there is a whole package of such discussions in that period, in the 1840s. And it will end with 1848, with the revolution, and with the kind of hardened position that emerges then, at which point very many pro-Czech Jews will become pro-German, actually. And David Kuh became very strongly pro-German in that sense. Now, literary projects. One of the most interesting literary projects was performed by this Siegfried Kapper. He was from Prague, from Smíchov, and Smíchov was at that time still before the city walls, or outside the city walls. And he spent a large time of his life in Bohemia, in Prague, but also he kind of migrated all over to Serbia and Hungary and other parts of the monarchy. But basically, why is he interesting? Well, he is interesting because in 1846, he published this poetry collection. And as you see, before that, he was very interested in folklore, in Slavic folklore across the board, not only Czech. And he published a translation, an anthology translation, a translation anthology called Slavic Melodies. His translation's 1844, so we are still in this bubbling period of the 1840s. But then in 1846, we have České listy, Czech leaves. And this is a poetry collection. This is not a translation. This is his original poetry translation collection in Czech. So that was something unheard of. That was the first book of a Bohemian Jew written in Czech, published in Czech. And I'll talk about the reception of this book a little bit. But let's look at least, the book was not only in Czech, but it had a content. It was dedicated to the local Jews. And the basic idea was exactly this, that they should speak Czech, should read in Czech, and follow what's going on around them. And what was going on around them was this late phase of the revival, which very soon turned into political nationalism, actually. So one of the very important lines in his poetry is what maybe many of you know as Reform Judaism. Namely, but here we are at the beginnings, in the very early days. What is the 9th of Av? Well, that's a holiday that, what's the right word, that commemorates the fall of the temples and in Babylonia and in Jerusalem. And it was, it's on the standard list of holidays. But at that time, especially in Germany, there comes this Reform Judaism. And Reform Judaism essentially says, there is no diaspora. We are here. We are not going back. This is all an illusion. We are here. We live in places where we were born, and we speak the language of the place where we were born. So in Germany, there is, for instance, these new editions of the prayer books of the Siddur, and they just crossed out next year in Jerusalem, because, and they did not value very much this holiday. This kind of was not, it didn't, lost its importance, although it was, of course, there. And there are very clear programmatic lines with which Kapper is addressing his kind of, there is an awful word like co-religionists or other Jews, Bohemian Jews, basically. Arise to life, grab the rudder of events, and offer your hand to your brethren. Not quite clear to me what brethren, whether he means Czechs. Love the fatherland. To whichever place destiny led you, that's where you found your fatherland. Stand manly, firmly there. Tam snašel vlast, maybe vlast, tam mužně pevně stůj. So this is these are very programmatic lines in the collection, and then there is a poem that was discussed many times and mentioned many times, and it's called Jen nekšechem mě nejmenujte. I have a kind of sorry, that was not the right button. I have a translation. I provided the translation. Here I have actually a question. I don't know how to translate nečech. I think that Czech is not very rich in these prefixes, surprisingly. And I, rather than translating it, don't call me non-Czech, I translated don't call me un-Czech. I don't know whether it passes. This is just my question here. Because I think that in English there are two prefixes, un and non. So think about the Committee for Un-American Activities. What it would be if it were a committee for non-American activities? Well, that would be a very different committee. So it would be about something else. So I think he means this un-Czech, like un-American. And what he says is, and I am mentioning this because this was often interpreted as, if he says, don't call me non-Czech, that it means call me Czech, which I definitely think he does not mean. And like you, I am a son of the Czech land, země. Like you, like your heart beats for the fatherland, vlast. So does like your heart beats, so does glowingly mine. And what if I am from the tribe on Jordan? This does not disturb brotherhood with the Czech. Czechem, I think it is there. What law is it that prevents me from living for the fatherland with heart and soul? My faith, the fatherland. My life grows from the same soil as yours. Soil is the connecting point. And in 100 years, the same soil will cover me like you. So this is the, I'm definitely on the line that he doesn't say, I want to be a Czech. I want to live with you together.
They're not citizens at this time.
No, they, 46, they are formally not citizens yet. But the notion of citizenship was changing. It's not kind of like exactly like our terms, but basically they were not full citizens. There was still a lot of laws that discriminatory. That were discriminatory. Well, at any rate, he wants brotherhood. He wants brotherhood, and that's a very interesting concept that it kind of ties in with these discussions we had before about what do we do here, how do we relate to the majority society, what is our function, how can we, what does it mean linguistically, and things like that. So this is another very programmatic poem in the book. Now, reception. This has been also known for a while. There was a very important critic, to some extent politician, journalist, Karel Havlíček-Borovský, and he destroyed this book totally and completely. And he says, basically, he has a very long article analyzing this, and the book starts with actually not very poetic statements. He is first discussing the question, what are Jews? What do they do here? And he says, one must not consider faith and religion, but firstly their origin and nationality. And by origin, he is already introducing something like race, basically. That's quite, that's, I think, arguable. And nationality, already at that time, there was no clear agreement what nationality is, but basically it means being Czech in this particular case. We must not thus conclude that Jews living in Bohemia and Moravia are just Czechs of Mosaic religion. We must rather consider them as a peculiar Semitic nation here, not a Semitic nation that resides in our country only by coincidence and sometimes happens to understand our language or is able to use it. So he already starts this review of this poetry collection. Well, the poetry collection is, of course, loaded with concepts. He starts it with this statement, and he then continues with or picks up one, this is a little bit of selection, one very important concept of the period. You cannot serve two lords, so to speak. There is no, today we don't think about that, but questions like multiple loyalty, multiple identity, dual identity, multiple identity, this was an anathema. This was impossible. The nationalism of that period was pushing into the direction either or. You are either Czech or German or Czech or Jew, but you cannot be both. You cannot have two fatherlands, two nations, which one calls one's own, thus serving two masters. Therefore, he who wants to be a Czech must cease to be a Jew. So these are already very tough statements. And they, in a way, imply that Jews should move if they don't behave. They should go somewhere else. And he suggests they should go to Germany.
Were the Czechs Christians?
Yes, they were Christians. They were not.
They were Christians.
Yeah.
It's okay to have religion as long as you're not a Jew.
Jews would typically have Jewish religion, okay? And Czechs would typically be Christians, and they would be either Catholics or Protestants, okay? So that was the situation at that time. Although most of them were already atheists at that time anyway, but that's another story. So, but he doesn't, he goes even farther. He destroys this sacred cup totally and completely by calling his poetry surrogate poetry. So he developed a theory that there is a genuine poetry and a kind of fake poetry. And Kapper, as a Jew, is rating this surrogate poetry. Once we have surrogates for coffee, sugar, gold, silver, no wonder that there is also surrogate poetry. So this is already a heavy, he doesn't actually have a Czech word for that. He says, že jest I surogát poezie. Well, that's a strange word. He means it is an adjective, but it's not an adjective. And even, he doesn't stop even there. And one usually starts that a poet must be born as a poet. But if true, this can apply only to a genuine poet, since loud poetry, and that's Kapper, as now fashionable, can be learned by anyone just, oh no, just like a dog can learn to retrieve. So this is already a very, so Kapper is basically, he learned how to retrieve. He's not a poet. And then he concludes he should go away. So the review was very rough, very he rejected Kapper as on many levels. First, I think I don't have that quote, but he says a Jew cannot be a Czech poet. I think I missed it. And then he says, Jews, watch out, they are here just, it so happens that they are here and understand our language. And then he goes into this rough poetology, if you want. Kapper just is like a dog retrieving what he learned somewhere. One should say that this was not received by unanimously. There was a kind of a minor author, Storch, and he reviewed that and said, this is unacceptable already at the level of basic politeness. It's just nitpicking, anti-Jewish rambling. And then he says Havlíček is a fanatic of the 19th century. The word anti-Semite did not exist at that time, but he says it comes kind of close. He is a fanatic nationalist who would like to see Jews somewhere else. So there was criticism. There was not. This was not. Havlíček was very influential, but he was not. And one should say, those of you who know a little bit about Czech literary history, he has also changed in many ways. He became more liberal. And Masaryk, actually, as I'm now thinking about that, Masaryk wrote a book about him later, and he appreciated this softening of the position that he saw in his work. And he said, in Czech, and that's very interesting, Masaryk says that in Czech in, I don't know when, 1890 or something like that. He says, and so he became a much softer anti-Semite. Mnohem, I think, mnohem jemnější or something like that. I don't remember the Czech. So if you say he became a softer anti-Semite, you conclude that he is an anti-Semite, but just softer. Yeah. So here we have Masaryk's authority on that. Yes?
Okay, earlier on, you posted the decree of the
Yeah.
ruler that the society if they behave.
If they behave, yeah.
Now,
This lives, this,
what did they do that where they, what instances were there where they didn't behave that you should
they,
have
did,
to behave?
they did not behave because they, A, didn't speak Czech, were not interested in the Czech cause, and they aligned with Germans. So especially in the 19th century, second part of the 19th century, in various elections, this was a whole discussion would be, in various elections, they went along with the German representatives, and this was, many Czech politicians said exactly this, they don't behave. They don't follow our interests. So this clause of good behavior was a central clause until, I would say, very late, maybe even into the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a symptomatic statement or symptomatic thing because it illustrates simply the force of Czech nationalism at that time. It's a symptom of Czech nationalism. Because for Czech nationalism, it was, especially in the second half of the century, but even before, I mentioned that I think it was impossible to be, the choice was either or. You could not have two, you could not be a Jew and Czech, you could not be a Czech and German, or you couldn't have two identities, or even, there are even even authors, already at the beginning of the 19th century, authors who wrote Czech and German were already rejected. You cannot serve two lords. You cannot have two. It's either that or that. And there is even a term from that time on that, which is, what is it? Obojživelník. What is it in English properly? Amphibian. There is a very strong rejection of amphibianism. You cannot write one day Czech and one day German, for instance, things like that. Yeah.
Just quickly, you said that they spoke German.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Why did they speak German? Is it because they migrated from?
In some cases they did, but the main thing was the Josephinian reforms. The Josephinian.
The question was, why did they speak German?
Yeah,
Where did that come from?
Yeah,
Why they, the Jews, spoke German and the
they
Czechs
spoke
did
German.
not?
They were essentially driven into German by Josephinian decrees. The Josephinian decrees very strongly required education in German, or supported education in German. So that was not the single only reason, but one of the reasons was already embedded in these 1780s, in these Josephinian decrees that simply required education in the local language, but the local language was understood to be German, basically. So that created an enormous wedge and divided for a very long time Czechs and Jews, because Czechs thought of Jews as Germans, basically. I'm giving a very kind of rough answer. Yeah.
So this question of duality, it was not specific or unique to Czech Jews. It was common throughout Europe, wasn't it? And isn't it still today?
Well, I don't know what it is today, but the question of dual whatever loyalty identity was important in the nationalist context. When nationalism was becoming, how should I say, a very radical, if not kind of, I'm lacking the word, when nationalism was a militant movement, basically, when that was one of the areas of conflict, you know. So you must follow our cause, meaning our nationalist cause. If you don't follow that, you are our enemies, essentially. So it was this kind of binary view, either or. And if you write poetry one day in Czech or one day in German, well, then you can't do that. It means you don't support our cause, basically, and that's the revival of the Czech language, essentially. So it's a complicated thing. What it is today. Okay, I stopped somewhere in 1860 or something like that. Okay, so, but I would like to say one thing that's very. It's not very well known and not really realized, but this rapprochement project in the 1840s, Siegfried Kapper, his collection, it was not so isolated as we may think. In Vienna, for instance, 1847, so this is just 1 year, and it was in reality less than a year, it was maybe half a year, there appeared a prayer book, a bilingual prayer book, Hebrew and Czech. So this is the title page of, sorry, I'm always doing this wrong thing. This is the title page, and it says Modlitby Izraelitův, prayers of Israelites. It's bilingual, so I don't have a picture of left and right column. And notice that there is a wonderful cover page with that illustrates Psalm 137, Under the Willows of Babylon. So there was a preface there, and it says, the preface says in Czech, given a long felt, so this is translation, given a long felt yet so unfulfilled need, it seemed to us that the followers of the Mosaic faith living in Bohemia and being competent in the Czech dialect should finally have Israelite prayers presented to them in their national language. So this prayer book was put together with supporters of Kuh and Kapper. It came from the same similar environment, and reading it Czech is entertaining in some sense. The translators were inventing new words. There is a lot of typos because the typesetters were obviously not Czech speakers, and it was in Vienna, and it had, to end on a realistic note, it had a very little impact. It's a rare book by now, but I am using it, and I kind of insist on it. It is Kapper's Czech poetry was not isolated. There was, for instance, this Czech Hebrew prayer book, and so what do we have next? All right, let's. Are you still? Okay, let's go to literature, German literature, German language literature, I should say. There was an author born in Bohemia, Jakob Kaufmann, and he unfortunately did not write all that much, but he attracted attention by, and again, we are in the 1840s, by a lengthy short story, kind of not clear whether it was really a short story or essay, and it was called The Bohemian Village Jew. And in it, he speaks in the first person, and he describes his trip in some kind of coach to a North Bohemian place where he is going to meet his friend, a Jewish man. And he is lying in that coach or in that wagon, and he says, I felt as if I could hear all streams of the Czechenland, from a distance clearly vibrating. The fabled Ottawa, the gold-flushing Moldau, the clear Elbe, etc. Libusa their Hussites with their flaming eyes. I saw the stormy clouds of the year 1620 hanging over Prague, you know what that was. Heavily, and the Czech people crying 3 days and nights over the defeat, Bílá hora, fasting and praying in order to avert the destruction, just, and here the last line is important, just like the Jews at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is one of the first statements in literature that says Jews and Czechs have something in common. And what they have in common is they lost their fatherland. And so he now is able to produce this whole inventory of historical events and various kind of local references in order, or that relate not to Jerusalem, that relate to Bohemia. That's where he is, that's where he is moving through. And then it makes him able to make these conclusions, like the Jews at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. This discourse, this theme continues. There will be more, there are many more examples of this in the 1840s. But it's not the end. In the same place where he has arrived, so he has arrived, it seems to me that he arrived at Pesach, and he is describing this friend of his, and he rents a pub. He is a what is it, publican or pub owner, and now what is happening there? So he does not live in the ghetto, in a ghetto. He's a village Jew. He lives among Czechs, so there is no indication of a Jewish alley or ghetto or anything like that. And let's read this passage. Year in, year out, he is not embarrassed. So this Jewish man, his face turned to the east to say his prayer in their presence, in the presence of the peasants, put on his tefillin, and disguises his skin and head with his prayer shawl. Funny as this may appear, none of the present guests will laugh about it. And during Passover, which lasts 8 days, he engages, he engages with them with often long, he engages them with often long religious conversations, explains them the origin of the holiday in a solemn rapture, and then even translates entire passages from his open Hebrew books into the Bohemian, into Czech. And the peasants, they are sitting around with their wooden pipes in their mouths, with large wide-brimmed hats sideways, elbows on the table, staring, head shaking, and listening attentively.
Before this, you always used the word Israelites. It's the first time you used the word Jews.
Where do we have Jews? Sorry, I missed that. That's the type. Well, there was again fluctuation of terminology. He calls the story. The story is called Village Jew, really Jude. But especially, well, I shouldn't say especially in Jewish sources, but the term Israelite was very common as well. that would be interesting to kind of figure out whether, how the choice is happening, whether Jew or Israelite. But it was there, definitely. So how do we read that? So Jakob Kaufmann. So he again, what do you think this is a statement of? Well, this is a statement of some sort of togetherness. Yeah. Is
that part of the rapprochement literature?
It is. He does not say rapprochement or reproach this, but it is in the same spirit. It is in the same spirit. The peasants don't laugh. The peasants listen. And notice that he is even translating. This is a very kind of a revolutionary thing. He's translating from Hebrew into Czech, obviously. So he's capable of doing it. All right, so these are kind of literary documents that I would say go in this direction of some sort of togetherness, living side by side, and without getting, and preserving one's identity as Jews. He is Jewish, and he's there, and he doesn't say, because I translate into Czech, I'm Czech or something like that. So he can do that. Okay, let's skip this. 1848 itself, the end of this pre-March period. I have just very few documents from this. We could have a whole lecture of this. Prague, full of anti-Semitic flyers, broadsheets, posters. And interestingly, however, I should say, meaning Jews are not on our side, and there is a lot of economical criticism, Jews exploit us and things like that. But I should also say that not all of these flyers were anti-Semitic. There were some liberal flyers as well, saying, well, if we want freedom, we cannot kind of, it cannot be our privilege. We must share it with others. We must be ready to, if we want citizenship, or we must agree that others may want the same. So in these posters, in these flyers, this is a small flyer, this is from the Prague City Museum. They were collecting them. The police were collecting them, actually most intensively than anyone else. And there are many of them, and some of them form threads. There are statements and counter-statements. And you would go from one flyer on one wall to the next wall, and there would be a response or something like that. But some were straight anti-Semitic. These are these market ballads, these cheap prints that were around. So this is a jolly song. It's a jolly song about Jews and their tricks or something like that. And then there is one new song, and that's probably the peak. And it says, and these Jews, the wasps of the land, that's the utmost pack. Grab them with no mercy like the beasts of the wood. The moment the Jew opens his eyes, he strips the Christian off his skin at once. Where there is a Jew, the people should grab him by his throat right away. And refrain, just do not hesitate and hang him at once. Just hang him up, hang him up, hang him up. So this is among the literature that was on the walls. But it's, of course, complicated because, as the editor of this song noted, this was handwritten. Someone handwrote it and put it on the wall. And police obviously picked it and preserved it. And so the language of the 1848 is a symptom of something that in some sense overshadows the language of the cooperation or cohabitation. It's a language that continues popular anti-Semitism that was there for a very long time. And now, since during the revolution, there was no censorship, at least for a while, this popped up. This was for a short period possible. Okay, so I think maybe, are you still? I see some enthusiasts, but I see already some people are tired. So I would say in the Austrian history there is the 1850s, and that's a period of stagnation. All the advantages through various constitutions were abolished, and that period ended in 1860. And that might be the topic of the next talk in 2 years. The 1860s were very lively, both on the Czech side and also on the Jewish side. For instance, on the Jewish side, we have at least 3 journals in the 1860s published in Prague, and they are all in German. There was apparently an initiative to publish a Czech Jewish journal in this new era, 1860s. But there is some note in Kapper's correspondence to someone that he says, let's wait with it. Probably not very many people would read that. So it's a symptom of developing Bohemian Jewish German culture. It's a symptom of liberalization. These magazines went in all possible directions. Some were liberal, some were very conservative, religious kind of. I think this Abendland was very conservative. Die Zeitstimme was liberal. Die Zeitstimme, for instance, had a long article about Palacký, how important a guy he was, and so on. So this line is continuing, but at the same time, the split continues. Especially the linguistic split and between Czech and German. There is still a very strong German Jewish culture, and no one who writes or works on it's more important to know German than Hebrew for this period in order to understand what was going on in this period. And then it kind of peaks in the period that we know very well, when Prague, especially Prague Jewish authors come up. They all write of course, in German. So I think let's maybe, there is even a German women magazine in the 1860s. So those of you who are not historians, those of you who know a little bit of history, it's relatively transparent. Those who are not historians, 1848, Austria kind of defeats the revolution, and there is this 10 years of the so-called Bach period that crashes, and we are now in the 60s, we are in the liberal period. And the liberal period from the Jewish point of view peaks in 1867. Liberal constitution, everyone is equal. 1867. Yeah. All right. Okay, that's another talk in 4 years. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your patience, and yes, questions if you have. Yes, please.
So how popular was comparisons?
Can you speak on the mic?
Sure. I
You were.
How popular was comparisons between the history of the Czech people and the Jewish people? Was it just a good idea by this one writer, Kaufman, that you showed us? Or was this like a popular thing to talk about?
Yeah. It was, so we are talking about high literature now. Kaufman and Kompert, whom I kind of left out. And with them, for instance, Kompert, Leopold Kompert, a very important author writing in German. And he is a co-creator of this notion of the Bohemian Jew. And he writes, and he is also writing about the village. So it's not much what we do is really Prague oriented. So he's writing about the village, and he is describing, he has various stories about Jewish children playing with Czech children, or Jewish children going to school with Czech children, and being interested, for instance, in Hasitism, in these types, especially in these parts of Czech history that the government did not like, like these kind of moments that Czechs liked in order to strengthen their stature, and so it was there, and but this whole great wave of the 1840s and the authors of the 1840s gets very weakened in the 1860s, surprisingly. So there are no great authors like Kaufman or Kompert, but there is some journalism that's there. And this, for instance, this Zeitstimme, for instance, had articles that were positive, for instance, about Czech history, things like that. Yeah.
Did you have shtetls? Oh, did you have shtetls in Bohemia the way you had in Poland and Russia?
No.
So you're saying the Jews were more integrated amongst the Bohemians?
The social organization was simply different, and there were no comparable shtetls. One of the reasons is is also the number of Jews in these areas. The Jewish minority in Bohemia never reached over 2%, except for Prague and some major cities, Prague really. But Galicia, for instance, the Pale settlement and the eastern parts, well, there were some cities that were basically only Jewish, and so it's there is a different kind of this is a different situation. So no shtetl, no.
Oh, I wanted to clarify the use of the language, as you call it. They were German, but I think it's not Prussia, Germany. It's what you're talking about, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Austrians were the dominant society. So you talk about Viennese German, right? The Jews essentially, as they were trying to assimilate, took on the language of the domineering social group.
Well, it's difficult. There was a standard. There was a notion of standard German.
Standard German, but you're not talking about them moving to Berlin or Prussia. You're talking about Vienna as the center of the empire.
That happened late in the 19th century, and the migration was mainly from Galicia. German was Vienna was a German-speaking center of the empire. Empire meaning Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So German had an enormous impact. That was one thing. The other thing, however, was that Germany, which did not exist until 1871, but Prussia had an enormous cultural impact. For instance, Berlin, Jewish Berlin was very important. Haskalah was basically These were Berlin Jews and so on. And also this Reform Judaism that is traceable in copper, that came from Germany as well. You know, there are these programmatic statements from Germany. Many communities there declare themselves Reform communities and say, we live here, there is no diaspora, we speak German, it's our mother language, and so on. Yeah. But otherwise, what is German is very difficult.
It's the dominant language of the empire.
At least in the West, yeah, at least in the West, language of the elite, and language of the, many cases, language of the, although not exclusively, but in many cases, language of the administration as well.
Right.
Yeah.
People coming from Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
that's what happened to Jews from the shtetls. As they assimilated, got educated, moved to towns, they picked the language of the dominant elite, Russian in many cases,
In,
as opposed to language of the
yeah.
Ukrainians and the
Yeah,
Russians.
yeah. As they were they were not moving from everywhere, but for instance, from these Austrian domains like Galicia. Yes, and when they came to Vienna, they would go to Vienna, like Josef Roth, for instance. Josef Roth, which we are talking about the interwar time. Well, his German is like wonderful, splendid. you cannot. You know, and he came, of course, from Galicia, but had throughout very solid German education. This was one of the reasons. It's very complicated, but basically one of the reasons is that higher education was in German for a very long time. For a very long time, there was that would be a long history, you know. Yeah.
You were talking about Haskalah and Reformation. Now, in the eastern part, and there was a movement against Haskalah.
Yeah.
Was that the case
Everywhere.
in Bohemia as well?
I am not a specialist in this, really, but there was, in Prague, for instance, there were some, let's say, right around 1800, there were some Jewish intellectuals, rabbis, who would participate in publications that came from Germany. But gradually, they tried to find their own way. And so especially on the religious line, there was a kind of an attempt to find a middle way, not necessarily be against it, but kind of absorb it in our own way. And what was happening in the East, you know, that's a totally different story, I would say, in the eastern part of the monarchy, yeah.
So, you know, I was reading the sources that you selected, and I'm reading them, you know, with hindsight, you know, knowing everything that happened afterwards.
Yeah.
And I can't help but thinking, like, as a historian, do you see, like, this naive repetition of Jewish people to think that they can coexist peacefully forever with their neighbors?
Yes, of course. There were. We are talking not about America, right? Not yeah. We are talking about that Central European area, and yes, that continued in one way or another. There were commentators, journalists, authors who went, and that's the fifth talk in 6 years. And then there was a whole movement which was called Czecho-Jewish movement. It was an assimilatory Jewish movement that wanted to, that's like 1880s basically, and basically students, Jewish students in Prague, and they wanted to continue in the steps of Siegfried Kapper. And actually, this is one of their publications, the calendar, and the first issue of the calendar is 1880 or 81, I don't see this right now. And this is the first volume, and this is copper. So there was kind of, and then especially in the interwar times, the First Republic, and so, yeah.
One more question?
Yes.
You mentioned in the Josephine degree, you know, that the Jews have to behave, right?
Yeah.
Now, I recall, I'm skipping, 50 years. I recall a conversation with Masaryk in Chapeks, and where Masaryk says, he wants to make sure that Jews behave, that they'll better themselves. What did he, meant something similar to what was meant in the 19th century?
Yeah, I have to look it up. I don't know this special passage, but there is a general kind of approach, and the approach is that the second part of the 19th century is militant Czech nationalism, and nobody could kind of remain clean in some sense. So I would not be surprised that Masaryk said. But at the same time, he liked Havlíček very much, for instance. He thought that Havlíček was an embodiment of Czech common sense. Well, that doesn't prevent him from talking about him as a somewhat softer anti-Semite. There are many interesting, but what you're saying is interesting. I thought that you were talking about Beneš. Because Beneš said, it's all right to be Jews, to be a Jew, but be a Jew in Palestine, not in Prague. So.
Any other question before we let our speaker go? Okay, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at some of our future programming. Thank you, Professor Toman.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest, questions, everything.